Welcome all, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. Today we are meeting across Lutruwita Aboriginal land, sea and waterways online. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people. The Palawa people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They cared and protected country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on the land, and they died on these lands. I honour them. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Before I introduce myself and our guests, there are a couple of housekeeping matters. Firstly, the session will be recorded and put on the YouTube channel with all our other webinars and a link emailed out. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please don't put them in chat. And in the latter part of tonight's session, we will respond to some of those questions. So my name is Dr. Gavin Daly. I'm a senior lecturer in the history program here at the University of Tasmania, and I'm delighted tonight to be hosting More Than a Story, this More Than a Story family history webinar. And our theme for tonight is families and war. And in conversation tonight, we are privileged to have two wonderful guest speakers with us. Firstly, we have Joanne Smedley, who is a curator of photographs in the photographs, film and sound section at the Australian War Memorial, initially joining the memorial as the first digital librarian in the research centre. Her move to the photographs team started 26 years of research and development of the memorial's 1.4 million photographs. I'll just repeat that, 1.4 million photographs. Her areas of research interests are studio photography, in particular the Darg Photographic Company of Melbourne during the First World War, and how memory is staged through photography. She has curated an exhibition called Framing Memory and participated in an Australian War Memorial podcast on this topic. And our second speaker is Dr. Bart Ziino, a senior lecturer in history at Deakin University, where he teaches 20th century Australian history and theories of history. He has written extensively on Australian experiences of the First World War, as well as remembrance practices and commemoration. He is the author of A Distant Grief, Australians, War Graves and the Great War, which came out in 2007, and I can thoroughly recommend. He is editor of Remembering the First World War, which came out in 2014, and is currently engaged in a study of private sentiment in Australia during the First World War. He has published on family memories of war, and his work on Australian children's experiences of war was judged the best article to appear in the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth in 2018. So a very warm welcome to the both of you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to kick things off with a general question to the both of you, and perhaps Bart, if you'd like to, if I could invite you to kick things off here. How do you think the scope of military history has changed over time?
Thanks, Gavin. It's a real pleasure to be here. I guess the scope of military history has changed in the expansion of its remit. You know, for a long time, military history was about generals and battles, strategic questions. And for about the last 50 years or so, it's expanded into what at one time was called the military social history. And that was really concerned with questions such as, what was it like to be in battle? What was it like to be a soldier? So, you know, the focus suddenly came down to individuals on battlefields. And from there, I guess it sort of radiated back out in a different way to start asking questions about Well, if war impacted individuals on the battlefields, how else did it impact people, and how else did it impact societies? And so this is where sort of military history begins to impact really very powerfully with other forms of history, and wars become occasions for learning about other phenomena besides war. They become a way of learning about social change in families, for instance. And so you can start to see patterns that you might not have been able to detect previously. So I think it's that the key here is the expanding idea of where military history actually impacts on individuals, communities, and societies more broadly.
Joanne, would you like to add to that? Thank you, Bart.
Yes, thanks very much, Gavin, and lovely to be here as well. I would just add that the sort of growth in family history research has really encouraged people to reach out to archives and places that might perhaps give them information they might not have got from the person, or perhaps the person themselves had not wanted to talk about it and dismissed the questions with a bit of a joke. When I first started working in the research centre, we had a lot of people who came in and said, I want to know why my relative got this particular medal. He told me I got it for opening cans of bully beef, and I heard this a number of times, and it was just like, interesting. So
Yeah.
on a very personal level, that's one of the quests that people have, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And there's certainly been a focus on individual experiences of war and the multiplicity of those experiences, I think, and how our concept of war, the definition of war, has broadened in terms of notions of time and space with war. That war, the history of war, the experiences of war don't begin when a war is formally declared or end when the war formally ends. And our sense that the space of a war is largely limited to battlefields has very much broadened, and the social and the cultural aspects of that has, in a sense, war is everywhere in some ways now, and I think, as Bart has said, has then fed back into broadening our understanding of social history and cultural history. There's been very much, I think, a symbiotic relationship once you had the opening up of military history to social history. As Bart said, it's been developing for some time, and the term new military history, I think, has been around since probably the 1960s, and it's still around, the idea of new military history.
It's become a bit of a straw man, hasn't it? The old military history.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think access to records and the internet and the increasing interest in genealogy have all played a part in people's questioning as well.
Yes. Yeah. On that note, Joanne, as a follow-up question there, how have the methods of military research and family history research changed over the past 3 decades?
Well, speaking from accessing material at the Australian War Memorial, there were it was a sort of a place where historians would come, and family historians were starting to come when I first joined the memorial, which is almost 30 years ago now. And it was quite people were accessing individual and original records, but the memorial itself was starting to actually create microfilm copies of high-use materials such as the embarkation rolls and the nominal rolls, and trying to make those more accessible to more people, not just those who could come to Canberra and use them there. The internet was really starting out in universities at that time. It wasn't really out in other institutions, although the War Memorial, as a relatively small agency, was interested and did set up an early website when many others were still trying to work out what was going on with the internet and how they could use it. I mean, microfilms are a technology which was seen to be preserving the original records and still providing access, and then copies of those microfilms were being distributed or sold through to other institutions such as state libraries and so on. So again, those records were, it was the start of a outreach, I guess. And over time, more people were coming in themselves to look at those records, see what they could find that related to their people, their relatives, trying to verify stories they might have been told.
Yes.
So, and of course, today we have, you know, very active digitisation programs that really provide pretty good access. And in some ways, it's a bit of a sword as well, because you don't have everything online. It's well nigh impossible, but there's an expectation that anything is available.
Yes. And just thinking there, what about the numbers of families who are now depositing records, personal letters, diaries with the Australian War Memorial? Has there been an increase in that? I know from talking to archivists at the Imperial War Museum in London about 10 years ago, they simply did not have the staff to keep up processing the sheer number of letters, diaries, and photographs that were coming in on a daily basis. I'm just wondering whether there's been a similar trend here, or...
To be honest, I think that has been the situation right from the beginning of the origin of these institutions. I mean, I don't know that they also envisaged the accessibility and the broadest interest that their collections would have, but I think many things have been catalogued or at least recorded at collection level. You always have noble aims that you're going to get all the individual records out. For example, if you go onto the War Memorial's website and you look at the numbers of items, now we've got about 1.4 million photographs, about 1.6 million items in the photos, film and sound collection. But if you go onto our website, it looks like we have 324,000 items, because that's the majority, well, that's what we have records for that people can either access or at least know we have. But we have many more, and they're safely recorded. With regard to the question of donations, we don't really struggle to acquire collections in some ways because, well, from a collection point of view, a lot of families want to have a safe repository for material. You know, floods and bushfires and other, you know, disasters are really things that always affect what people feel are the safe custody of a collection. And we certainly have an online form that people can fill out, but we have to assess material because we cannot accept everything that is offered. We don't have the staff either. We don't like, we do the best we can, and we certainly are able to locate a lot of material. We're collecting across many conflict periods, and we're currently collecting a lot. Well, we collect across all formats, but currently, of course, with modern conflicts, the formats are largely digital for photographs, film and sound content. And for a preservation program for any part of the collection, even that aspect of it can take up a lot of storage space. People think you can scan something. Well, we scan at preservation levels. It can sometimes take an hour, depending on the size of the negative, but it can take up to an hour to scan a negative to preservation standard for our collection. So if you do the maths, that's
wow,
that's
1.4 million.
It's a big job.
It certainly is, and
bigger than all of us, really.
A huge responsibility and a vitally important one at that. Well, thanks for that, Joanne. Just a question for you, Bart. Military history has traditionally been thought of as you've already pointed out, is relating to the experiences of soldiers and male combatants. How can we use military sources to also understand the impact of war on families and communities?
It's a good question. I guess you probably got to think back a little bit to why those records exist in the first place. And, you know, Joanne already mentioned things like embarkation records. And that, you know, we try to remember they're created in the first place so that the state can mobilize and sustain a fighting force. And in the case of the two world wars, I mean, we're talking about these enormous armies. I mean, the Australians in the First World War sent 330,000 people overseas. So that's 330,000 people on those embarkation records. And so, you know, this involves data collection on a massive scale just to keep the military organisation functioning. So you can understand through that how it's, you know, reasonably easy to chase up a soldier or a service man or a service woman through those records. The other thing, I guess, to come to your question to bear in mind is that soldiers and nurses and all sorts of personnel are never fully disassociated from their families and their home communities when they serve. And you know, that's really visible in the two world wars. But it's no less true in other wars in which Australians are participating. But because of that massive involvement of citizens in those wars, you can see it really clearly. So what that all really means is that the conduct of fighting wars implicates families, right? They're affected by it. Sometimes they're participating directly in it. They're doing things for the government, like buying bonds and all sorts of stuff. And we can actually see those people in the records that are created actually with one service person in mind. So you know, the families are the people who are receiving pensions, for instance. They're the people who are worrying about the well-being of their loved ones, and they're writing letters to the military agencies and asking about the welfare of their people. So, you know, in a soldier's service record, you turn up somebody very anxious about someone who's been wounded, and suddenly you get an insight into what it's like to be worried about your loved one at the front. So suddenly the record becomes capable of telling you another story beyond just what's going on at the front. And that expands all over again when these folks come home and they're still in a relationship with the government through the repatriation department, who's looking after their health. You know, today, of course, is the Department of Veterans Affairs. And, you know, if I think of the work of someone like Marina Larson, you suddenly see that it's families and communities who are implicated in the care of those people. So it's not just the government dealing with this individual soldier, it's the government dealing with that person and relying on families to help in this. And you start to hear the voices of those people who are not, their name's not on the front of the file, but they're woven all the way through it. And so this has been sort of the great achievement, I guess, of so many historians in the last 2 to 3 decades, is to find those people and remind us that, you know, the conduct of wars, and again, especially those two world wars, is the story of whole communities at war and families bearing the brunt of what's going on, and not just the pointy end on the battlefield. And that's where you know, the study of those military records makes it possible actually to start seeing those stories. So that's, I mean, I'm sure we'll come to it, but it's something that actually can provoke some different kinds of understanding of warfare when we come to it as family historians.
Yes, yeah, and looking beyond the facts of the records and the endless acronyms to see the broader social and family dimensions that can, as you say, can sometimes surprisingly appear in the least likely spots. It's the
Truly,
nature of historical research and discovery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So if we dig down a bit more now into those actual sources, and Joanne, the 1.4 million photographs, how can we use photographs to understand war stories? And as a follow-up to that, what are the risks and benefits there?
Well, our collection is comprised of material that was taken by official photographers, essentially for propaganda and record purposes. But as well as that, we also have a large collection of soldier photography. And I'll always like to think that the two aspects of photography come together and tell a more complete story. I mean, the soldier photography, they're taking their individual experience, their mates, their experiences, their impressions. They were taking photos of their tents and things that they were sending back to their family to either reassure them or to at least give them some sense of what they were experiencing without trying to potentially horrify people and so on. And of course, official photography, we had official photographers that were appointed late, sort of on the Western Front. There was the point in time when they were first there. So a lot of the material from the Gallipoli campaign, for example, in Egypt, was taken by either professional photographers, British official photographers, and private photographers. So photography itself was a fairly burgeoning hobby. A lot of people were keen to take photographs and send things back to their families and explain what was going on, and buy commercial photography as well, because some commercial photographers or studios were actually purchasing people's images and then distributing them on a wider scale. I mean, not everybody had a camera, not everybody was able to take those images. So there was a general sharing of experience through that distribution of photographs. What you can also learn from those is you don't always trust what you can see, because they're not always what they intend to be.
Yeah.
But they're part of a story, and you don't take probably anything in isolation. You weigh up all the different types of records, and you pull a picture together.
Yes. Yeah.
So from our point of view, we sometimes get photographs with limited captions, and we try and unpick the clues of what we're looking at, such as, you know, the color patches and the rank insignia and things that would help us potentially identify people pictured on the images, in the images. So you become a bit of a detective, I think, at some point.
They're so important, those portrait photos, aren't they, Joanne? You know, I mean, I know the Darg photographic studio ones that you've done so much work on, and they're in Australia. They're photos that people take prior to leaving. But then, of course, people are sending home portrait photographs throughout the war as well.
They are.
And you know, again, you have to ask, why are they doing this? And perhaps you can tell me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is that they're a kind of a proof of life document, you know.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, they show visually, you know, what you can't say, well, you can say in a letter, but they show visually to those at home, I am okay. And, you know, you can, I haven't aged terribly, or perhaps you'll think I have.
Well, sometimes I think they have.
But they're really valuable. I mean, to us, we look at them, I guess, and we say, oh, isn't that nice to have a picture of such and such? But to the people who took them and then sent them through the post, and the people who received them, I mean, they're really precious objects that give you a sense of connection.
They definitely do, and I think I mean you can talk about the proof of life thing. I think is to my mind that's always been a reassurance or a, you know, try and let everybody know you're okay, and it's also been used to um, share stories, um, but also sometimes when you have a soldier who dies as a result of their service, it might be the last known image of somebody,
Mm.
and it sort of really acquires a different layer of poignancy. Um, we had a big program to collect portraits of people who died as a result of service. It's been a collection that the memorial, well, in fact, the Department of Defence started gathering these photos well before there was any physical building called the Australian War Memorial. Um, we actually sent 1,000 or so of these portraits that were collected over a period of time to the Imperial War Museum, formed part of their collection as well. And the one of those images that was sent to the memorial or sent to the Department of Defence for that purpose had one person's name, but it had three people pictured. And I think about the 1920s, there was a lot of pasting of photographs on pages, and information was written in registers, but the materiality of what is actually written on the back of a photograph was lost because they were stuck on these pages. And I actually had this one particular photograph removed, and it was a photograph which, when I saw the back, I could work out who was who by doing it. And we had a sergeant who had his photograph taken by one of his platoon, who'd given a copy to the sergeant. The sergeant, he'd written on it to the sergeant. The sergeant then wrote on it and sent it home to his mum. And then when this sergeant died, the mother had annotated it as well. And it suddenly became this totally different object because these three different handwritings
Mm.
had three simple but very poignant and effective messages.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, that's all very fascinating, and I guess letters are also, and postcards are that sign of life, but that focus on the photograph and the primacy placed on the body in war, and I think it can also be interpreted in that sense as well, and how that resonates in a way perhaps that a letter or postcard doesn't. But having said that, letters and diaries, but what aspects do you think of letters and diaries can illuminate those connections between soldiers and families?
Yeah, well, these are sort of fundamentally different to those official records I was sort of talking about earlier, you know, the ones that are about administering big military organizations. The letters and diaries are the personal documents that, you know, on one level they take you right inside, or can take you right inside sort of the world of the individual who's writing them. And you know, I mean, this was the sort of thing that really kicked off that sort of new military social history back in the 1970s. If you think of sort of the big works of the Broken Years, in Australia anyway, the Broken Years by Bill Gamage, or overseas there was John Keegan's Face of Battle, and Patsy Adam Smith's The Anzacs used the same method of reading those letters to try and tell us something about the question, you know, what is it like to be on the battlefield? What's it like? I think, you know, at one stage Bill Gamage was sort of prescient enough to talk about his book being a kind of emotional history, which is he wrote that back in the 1970s, and that's the term we've been using, you know, very a lot over the last decade. So, you know, full marks for him there. You know, so you could get a sense of what it was like to be there, a sense that tended to break down, I guess, the idea of you know, brave men on the battlefield, and you could start to understand that this was not a very pleasant experience all the time. And the people who started to look then again at those letters and diaries even more closely started showing us that, one of the things you can see soldiers doing and nurses doing when they write in these things is to think about how they can articulate a sense of self through this, to talk about the job they're doing and how they feel about themselves. And they also tended to find that writing things down, and this counts for soldiers and nurses, but also all sorts of people in the past who write letters and diaries, it's about making sense of what you're going through. And putting it on the page can help you to put structure around things that are otherwise difficult to digest, and battle is one of those things. Helps you to work through it, helps you to explain it to other people. So in one sense, the letters and diaries are about getting inside that internal world and asking what's it like, but also allows you to ask questions like, how did they cope? How did they deal with what they're going through? And then, those questions, if you're lucky enough as a family historian to get your hands on one of your ancestors' collections of letters, I mean, those are questions that in my own research, I've found family historians have been really interested in, especially when it's someone you know, and you suddenly can start to see people that you knew completely differently, because you're suddenly inside their head, and you're seeing that they're perhaps not as strong and resilient and robust as you always imagined them to be. You can get a different perspective on wartime events. It can be different even to what they may or may not have told you about. So they're extraordinary documents for people who knew those people. I might just mention, the other thing that's happened with letters, especially in the last couple of decades, is that where those early historians like Bill Gamage and Patsy Adams Smith used to use them as sort of testimonies of soldiers' experiences, what we've tended to sort of think about in the last little while is the original context in which these documents were created, and to remember that actually when we write letters, we're writing them to somebody, and and for a purpose, right? We don't sit down and just write down, here's what happened. And so we tend to start thinking about letters as a two-way street. And what's going on here is that on one hand, soldiers and nurses are trying to explain to people at home what's going on, or at the very least, writing to them as part of an obligation to say, I'm okay. It's the same thing that's going on in the photographs Joanne was talking about. They're there to say, you try not to worry too much. All right, this is what's happening. This is where I'm at. So even letters that look a bit bland on the surface are really there as again, to use that terrible phrase, proof of life, right? They held this letter. And the letters that go the other way are also about that relationship and about telling people, hey, we still care about you, and we love you, and we hope you're doing okay. So there's a mutual obligation going on there in those letters, which has become a really important thing for us to study, because it again expands our understanding of the wars and how they function, and how people at home are directly implicated in fighting it, or at least supporting the fighting. So they are really the rich pay dirt, I guess, for those of us who are keen on the question, what happened and what was it like?
Yeah. And just the sheer volume of letters that were written, the numbers of letters written by soldiers, and just the sheer logistics of the postal service in the First World War is staggering. The number of letters that were arriving every day on the Western Front, for example, and then going in the other direction.
It's extraordinary. And look, anyone who's familiar with old Keith Murdoch going to Gallipoli and stirring up all sorts of trouble might just want to remember that he was only ever sent to overseas to sort out the postal arrangements because of all the complaints that were going on about it. So that was his ticket to get over there and start doing the things he actually wanted to do. But the post, I mean, it's fundamental actually to keeping people going on both sides of the battlefront and the home front.
Yeah. And I guess to those letters and diaries, they're living and breathing in a sense that we can continually return to them and ask new questions, and ask new perspectives on those letters and what they illuminate. Joanne, did you want to add something there?
Oh, I just wanted to say I've seen a number of letters that are numbered because I think the soldiers numbered their letters home and then would say, there'd been like replies back and forth between the family that they hadn't received letter number 50 or I think they were worried things weren't going to get to their final destination. I mean, when you think about the confusion and people moving around on the Western Front and other places, it's almost amazing that they did receive post so readily.
Yes, yeah. We might turn to some of the questions that we have in our Q&A. And we have a question here that Joanne mentioned, that photos of soldiers from World War I were collected by the War Memorial. How would I go about searching to see if I can find a photo of a relative who died as a result of action?
The photographs should be described and linked to the people record that is on the War Memorial's website. There were no identity photographs taken in the First World War, so the collection of photographs we have is purely acquired through people donating them, so almost serendipitous. Many people did because it was very common to go and get your photograph taken, but whether they survive is another matter. And one of the original intentions that Charles Bean had for the War Memorial was to actually create a photographic frieze of portraits of all of those who died as a result of their service. And I feel that idea could never be realised because they just didn't receive a photograph of everyone who died. I mean, there were a lot of casualties, despite many attempts in the media and so on. So it's a difficult task. But those photographs that were acquired from 1918 and still get acquired today are carefully stored, kept, and ultimately will have a presence on our website.
Okay, right.
So you should be able to find something by searching a person's name.
And a follow-up, an associated question with that that's been asked is, are there many letters that are returned after a soldier was killed in action? Is that common?
Yeah. Well, yes, it is, because the Australians and New Zealanders are the furthest from the front, right? I mean, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for a letter to get just on the ship and to the continent where the soldiers are serving, and then it's got to go through the postal arrangements there. So you can understand that if a soldier dies, then all the letters you've sent in that period are going to come back. And it's one of the sort of awful things that happens to people is that, there is a cable service, so you can get the message that someone has died reasonably quickly, but then you're going to start getting all the letters back from the front bouncing back to you. And so it's this awful situation for people who keep getting their letters back, and indeed keep getting letters from the soldiers themselves that they sent before they died, long after they've got the news that they've died. So on one level, it's a terrible situation. On the other, I've got to be kind of pleased with this for myself, because one of the characteristics of the collections of letters that we've got is that they are very one-sided. Most collections in places like the War Memorial or the state libraries or the Heritage Office there and the library in Tasmania, if you look at them, they're mostly the letters of the soldiers. And the reason for that is that soldiers moved around a lot. They found it difficult to keep letters. There were even official prescriptions that you destroy letters so that the enemy doesn't get their hands on them. So actually, if you want to learn something about what it was like for people in Australia through the letters that they wrote in massive quantities, sometimes it's those letters that bounce back because someone has died that allow you to see that. It's a sort of a terrible consolation prize for us in the present from somebody's pain in the past.
And we also have the letters that then would, if someone was declared missing as well, the particular agony and suspension around that, and all the letters that might go to the Red Cross and else, which is a separate issue in itself.
A number of people put in a photograph when they put those Red Cross requests in. So if the person had lost their ability to speak, then a photograph might be used to help identify them. Of course, the reality is, there was possibly no chance of any identification ever happening.
Yeah. We have another question here relating to letters, and that is how much censoring occurred.
Yeah, well, I would say not as much as you imagine. There was an active censorship, and it was usually, as far as soldiers' letters were concerned, it was performed by their officer, their immediate officer, so lieutenant. But what they were censoring, by and large, was information that could be useful to the enemy. So information about troop movements, what battalion you were in, where you were, that sort of thing. But not so much, I hate it here, or anything that you might say about your experience tends to get through. They're not so concerned about that. So you could write some quite graphic things, and there are some really even today, reading some of the letters from soldiers about what it's like to go through battle are harrowing accounts that went through the censorship. On the other hand, soldiers could self-censor for fear of having their letters cut up or have the blue pencil put through them, as it was in the First World War. So that it is true that the implied pressure of censorship could constrain people as well. But you don't have to read too far into collections of soldiers' letters to start finding things that surprise you in terms of what they were allowed to write about. But if you said there are this many of us and we're in this sector, well, then you're in a lot of trouble, and that'll get cut up.
Yes. So it's the ubiquitous somewhere in France knows, and no troop movements, no numbers, but their emotional and psychological state, if they themselves were able to articulate that, was more likely to be aired amidst all the other, the everyday, what's sometimes been called the banalities of their everyday existence in the conflict zones.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do recall reading a letter that was part of the War Memorials collection. It was an official collection, not a private collection. And in this particular letter, it had been caught by the censor, the guy's lieutenant, and it was a soldier who'd had a couple of years of service and he'd pretty much had enough, and so he was writing to his brother to give him some hints about how to potentially fake a racing heart and a trench foot to try and shorten his period of service. So
Mm.
that got caught by the censor, so I don't believe the brother
Okay.
ever saw it.
I've that is it. I remember looking at First World War letters and trying to work out what had been, in the British case, looking at what had been blue. I mean, Bart talked about the blue pencil, working out what it was. Or sometimes I've seen scissors taken to sections as well of British letters. We have a question here about, can I ask about donating medals to the War Memorial? Can you do that and make sure they're not able to leave Australia?
The memorial's website's got information about
Mm-hmm.
donations, and it's certainly something you can ask at the point of making an offer of donation. There is legislation that also covers the movement of cultural heritage. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
quite sure of all of the material that would be covered by that. But if material that is in the memorials collection is requested for loan or another exhibition, it has to go through all sorts of processes and security and so on, which would always be questions that our registration team would be ensuring was appropriate for the material.
Okay. And we have another question on, Joanne, is there a guide you use or just your own knowledge in terms of how you date photos based on the clothes they wore? I'm assuming soldiers' uniforms.
Yes, oh, well, I mean we have some excellent experts in our military heraldry and technology section, and we often call upon them to give us advice. Um, we would use any number of published resources, and there are a few books on dating photographs that have been useful in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, if it's a serviceman's photograph and we have access to his service record, if he's got sergeant stripes and you look up his service record and he was a sergeant for a period of 9 months, you've got a 9-month window in which that photograph could have been taken. So we do use a lot of visual clues,
Mm-hmm.
and we look at the information that might come with the donation or might be with the photograph itself or in the album or related images if it's more than one in the collection. So we use a variety of things to come to a conclusion.
So
Doing your
detective
art.
work,
Yep.
knowledge,
Yes,
intuition,
all
26
of it.
years of experience of poring over those 1.4 million photographs. Um, what else we've got a question here on a very interesting question on what was buried with the soldier at the front.
Ooh.
Mm.
Well,
Mm.
it depends how much time you've got and all that. Look, there are some administrative elements to this. I mean, soldiers had a pair of identity discs, and they had a pair because one was meant to be removed from the body as proof that they died, and they should be to register them, and the other remained with the body in order to identify those remains should they be exhumed, and many of them were exhumed later to remove them to consolidate them in bigger cemeteries.
Yeah.
For the most part,
I think that
sorry,
double
Joanne,
identity, sorry, the double identity disc I think came in later because I think there were issues. The Pheasant Wood burials had one identity disc, and because that was removed from the records, which is why there are so many that were unable to be identified in that particular grouping. So I think that double disc I thought came in a bit later.
I'll defer absolutely to your knowledge on that.
I hope I'm correct.
Well, someone
Not a
can do some
photograph,
diligent
but
work. The other part of it is, I mean, once you identified a body, I mean, you try and take all the personal objects that somebody at home might like. So, rings, watches, wallets,
Yeah.
crucifixes, all that sort of stuff, because that's the critical stuff that people at home want, you know. And I've read so many service records where they're saying, have you got anything from the body? You know, all I want is something that he touched or was on him at the time. So, you know, those little things were really important. And it just goes back to the point you raised earlier, Gavin, that, you know, the figures on how many people are just missing are terrible. And people were denied all sorts of comforts through that, you know, denied any knowledge of where the body was, if they'd been well treated in death, but also you couldn't have any of those objects, and they were really important things. And it's, you know, that's where some of those objects that I'm sure so many people in the audience will know, you know, the old, what they call the dead man's penny, the big brass or bronze disc that was issued to next of kin of the dead that says, you know, such and such died in the cause. I mean, that thing could really be significant as a, it's not a good trade-in for a body, but it was something that you could say, well, I got this instead. You know, not a great one, but that's what it was there for.
Yeah. And I guess one thing in all of this tonight is the particular space between Australia and particularly First World War battlefields, and just how those extended dimensions of time and space affected relationships between soldiers and families in terms of how long it took information to get there, and also issues around the missing and pilgrimage afterwards.
Oh, absolutely. Gosh, there's an awful lot of questions about how to find
there are
people in different countries and everything.
Yes. We've got a question here. Any suggestions on what to do if you have a photo, a name, but the name doesn't match any records in the archives?
It's when you might need to have a look at the image itself and see if there's some clues that are, perhaps it's a uniform from a different country, or it could be a pre-war photograph, could be a militia uniform as opposed to an AIF uniform.
Yes.
It's a sort of they can be reasons. People can also enlist under different names. Many did. Without seeing the image, it'd be hard to know what the absolute answer might be, but they'd be things I'd look at.
Yes. Yeah. Another question here is mentioned that a letter could be considered a proof of life. I wonder if much is known about families that were informed after the arrival of a last proof of life letter that had taken many weeks to reach Australia, that the soldier at the front had now deceased. Do we know much about that part of family history?
Oh, well, yeah, it's the tragedies of that system of well, I mean, they did the best they could, but yes, I mean, that happens frequently, and often, you know, it takes a long time to establish that somebody has died. That's why we've got the Joanne might speak to the extraordinary archive of letters to and from the Red Cross who are trying to trace people, which the Australian War Memorial's got online, I think, in full these days.
They are.
It was a wonderful family history resource, actually, but it takes you into some really awful territory, in fact, if you want to understand what it was like for people coping with loss in the First World War. That's the place where you go, right?
Yes, and that they're all available online, are they now? Those Red Cross records.
They are. So the First World War ones were sent to Australia from the Red Cross, but the Second World War ones, I believe, were still in Switzerland in their archives. So I'm not quite
Okay.
sure how we ended up with those, but it's fantastic that we do. I mean,
Yeah.
quite poignant being able to read physical descriptions of people, and also, you know, how tricky it is to try and recall someone and identify them because the conflicting descriptions are sometimes marked. So,
Yes, yeah. And we have a question here about a great uncle who died as a scout at Gallipoli, but was declared wounded, then missing, then back in action, then over in Malta. It took until mid-1916 for the family to know he had died. Many letters written to him and returned. Is this a common scenario? My great-grandmother was even trying to contact Turkey to find out if he was a prisoner.
It is. Sorry, Joanne.
not at all.
It really is, at Gallipoli especially. That organisation we were just talking about with the Red Cross actually doesn't really get its momentum going until the end of the Gallipoli campaign, and so the news about what had happened to the people at Gallipoli took a lot longer and was much more patchy than the word on people who died in subsequent campaigns. So yeah, the question is, was it common? It really was, and people would get all sorts of conflicting reports of who had died and who hadn't died, and yeah, it's awful actually to see their sort of hopes going up and then get shattered mostly.
Yes, as an insight in just the extraordinary emotional state of families with no certainties, and just the complete shifting contours of that. And perhaps we've got one last question here. If I can identify a soldier in a photo who hasn't yet been identified, who would be the best person to contact?
We have an online form where people can submit information about photographs. They get researched and changed if they're believed to be correct. We usually ask for comparative images and other information.
Great. Okay, well, look, I'd love to keep this conversation going for hours, but unfortunately we do have to bring things to a close. This has been a fantastic discussion, a really useful discussion at so many senses about the big pictures, about the nature of military history, and then digging down into the sources themselves, photos, letters, diaries, and very specific questions asked from our audience tonight. So I hope everyone has got a lot out of tonight. I've certainly learned a few new things, and so I hope it's been great value to everyone who has registered and come along tonight. I want to thank you all, and Joanne Smedley and Bart Ziino, a very special thank you indeed for your time, expertise, and wisdom tonight. Very much appreciated.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next session is on the 23rd of August. The theme is Research Showcase. Watch your emails for the registration link. Thank you.